Okay, welcome everyone to the next session on subscriptions in R4B. We have a small room, a big topic, and we'll have 35 minutes of presentation by Gino, and then we have 10 minutes for Q&A, both for online attendees and for the room. And if you have questions here in the room, you will have to use the microphone. So I'll come up with you if you have a question. So Gino, please.
Sounds good. Thank you, Reen. Welcome. Today we're going to talk about FHIR subscriptions. My name is Gino Canessa. I'll get to that in a minute. Minutia-wise, right here on the bottom of the deck, the aka.ms/DevDays Gino has this deck and all my other DevDays decks too. So the deck will be link heavy. I don't recommend trying to type in all the links yourself. That's why they're here. It should also be in Whova as a handout. Either way, however it's easiest to get it, but save you the trouble of typing them all in yourself later. Let's see. So first, the TLDR on me. I'm a software engineer at Microsoft. I'm in research on the standards and interop team. So it's great. I can come talk to you about subscriptions and all great core FHIR things, but I cannot answer any questions about Azure because I have no idea. So just keep that in mind when you're asking questions later. I've been doing FHIR for a few years now, really focused on infrastructure, tooling, code generation, subscriptions, fun stuff like that. I was in the DICOM world for a couple of decades before that. Interop there is a different story, or at least was at the time. And that's all the CDs that people are still getting, even though you don't have a CD drive in your computer. Apologies, they were a great idea at the time. And we always thought they had about 5 years of life before they got thrown out, and still waiting on that to finish. Last, contact info, email address, Zulip. Zulip is definitely the better way to get a hold of me, but email is more official looking. And then there's the YouTube channel link. I put educational content there, and there's links specifically later for subscriptions that I do for the Connect-a-thon that walks through the spec and very detailed doing all those things. It's a lot longer than 45 minutes, so we'll get an abbreviated version here. So why do we need to talk about subscriptions? And really, the first thing we need to index on is REST. When we talk about FHIR, generally we're talking about the REST model of communication. That's the primary paradigm that we use. It's generally based on the HTTP protocol. And I say generally because if you look at the FHIR interactions versus the HTTP verbs, they're a little bit mismatched, but close enough. But it's really client-driven interactions. When we talk about REST, it's always the server is sitting there stateless, and the client is making a request, whatever that request may be, and doing something with the server. It's great, stateless, cacheable, all these things. But we have a polling problem. And the problem is that if you need to know when something happened and you're a client with a stateless server, all you can do is ask. And you just have to keep asking. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Is there new data? Is there new data? Is there new data? And that's not great. There's a lot of problems with that. From the client side, especially if you're talking about mobile devices, you're talking about waking up from sleep, you're talking about network access, you're talking about all these things. On the server side, you're talking about handling repeated queries from all of your clients, even though nothing's changed. If a patient's only coming in for their annual exam and they're asking you every 10 minutes for new data, that's pretty inefficient. So we want to fix that. We want the server to tell me when the data changes. So it's a server-driven workflow. And that's it. We're done. Problem solved. We can all go home, have cookies. Thank you. That's it's that simple. I like to put this up because just to show how terrifyingly complex something that simple sounding is. And if anyone has worked with software before, you know that if something sounds simple, you should run because it's not going to be easy to work with. Fortunately, this was identified all the way back in the DS2 days. So very early in FHIR, subscriptions was added. During that time, between DS2 2 and 3, some other projects split out for more specific use cases. So the CDS Hooks project, clinical decision support, those are kind of closed loop in workflow things, like I'm going to order a medication and it needs to check if that's there's an allergy. You need that at the time you're ordering, and it has to happen closed loop. FHIRcast is another one that's for real-time communication between different applications. So the kind of canonical example of that is a radiologist with an EHR, a dictation system, and a radiology viewer, right? All those apps need to know that you're on the same patient, and they need to know at the same time. So it's less about transmitting data than it is about transmitting state. And during all this time, subscriptions just sat there. STU3, R4, and then in R4, people realized it was sitting there because it wasn't great. It was based on queries that you would just submit, and the server would have to track when the result sets changed. So in R4, they said, let's redesign it for R5. And then people said R5 is too far away, so let's backport that to R4, and we ended up with R4B and the backport IG. So again, the query-based subscriptions that we had, I'm not going to spend too much time here, but it was a great first stab at subscriptions. There were some issues with scale, things like that. It worked great for some use cases and was unsuitable for others. And so the redesign to topic-based subscriptions. And this is kind of, if you're more familiar with web sub, pub sub, all these kinds of things, that's kind of the model we're going after. We're saying that you can have defined resource change, like an update to a patient resource. You can have an event, like something from V2 catalog or a shift change in the facility. Whatever those things are, they're topics. And then servers can choose which topics they support. With common topics across systems, then you can get a lot of this great interoperability that we're all striving for. That's why we're here. But servers can still implement the things they need in an optimized way. And really, it's about enabling these server-driven workflows that are kind of not possible today. So for R5, essentially, again, this is just kind of a summary of saying we added some new resources, subscription topic, resource that has the topic information we'll get into here, subscription status, so that this is part of the notification bundles, and then some more flexibility in subscriptions so that you can use custom protocols and things like that if you need to send notifications in different ways. So the backport IG, which is more interesting, we are submitting our publication request whenever FMG meets next. They've been off for a couple of weeks between this and prepping for this. So hopefully that will be published and able to be used in production soon. But essentially we added those same resources to R4B that we'll go through here in a minute. And then for subscription, we couldn't change the resource in R4B. It's a minor update in that sense. And so we have a bunch of extensions and profiles and things to add all that functionality to it. So the parts of a subscription. Again, the first one is the topic. So there, again, as I said, there will be a lot of links in here. Those are the links to the subscription topic resource in R4B and R5. It's really defining a few key things that are generic for what you're implementing. So it's what causes a notification, right? You want to say this is whenever a patient is admitted to the hospital, right? That's kind of the description of the event. What filters you can use. So same thing, when someone's implementing things, you want to say, oh, you can search on anything you want, but a server can't implement that at scale. So for something like a patient encounter notification, you might say, well, we can filter on the patient ID. When you create the subscription, you need to give me the ID of the patient. And that's something we can implement and actually do at scale, is give you your patient encounter notifications for this ID. You also define related resources that you might include. So you say, great, patient encounter notification gives me the encounter, but we're also going to potentially include the patient. We might include some history that we have in different, observations, things like that. So all those things are what you can expect to get when you implement this. So that's the topic. Then you have the subscription, and that's really the thing that says, take a topic and now give me these actual notifications. So you're configuring how much information you want, how much payload there is, all that stuff that we'll get into for privacy and security. The actual filters. So the topic said you can filter on ID. I want ID 1, 2, 3, 4, right? That's the concrete piece of that. And then obviously the endpoint information. Where am I sending the notifications to? Not as useful to have a subscription if you don't actually get the notifications. So that's an important piece of info. And then the last piece in the spec is about the notifications themselves. They're just FHIR bundles. In R4B, we're using history bundles because that's what was available. In R5, we have a new bundle type that's a little more specific with a little better rules, but we don't have to worry about that. This is just the details on the subscription topic, which we talked through a lot already. So it's a canonical resource, a definitional resource, if you're not familiar. Things like questionnaires, subscription topics. These are things that are not like a patient that's representing an actual patient. Those are domain resources or an encounter that's representing a thing. These are things in their own right, definitional things. They will be in the FHIR registry, and I meant to update that text after R4B release to when the registry is updated. So those will be available shortly since R4B is now released. You can define, you can derive, you can reference them, all kinds of good things. And again, that's the description I was just going through. You define what causes a notification, define your filters, and define the shape. So some examples, again, patient admission, this is one we were just talking through. You would probably center it on the encounter resource, and you want it to trigger when an encounter is either created or updated to in progress. You might filter on the patient ID or group membership, and then you might include the patient, practitioner, location, all kinds of stuff like that, depending on what your goal is. Another example, new explanation of benefit, insurance-related, payment-related stuff. But you might say anytime one is created, in addition to filtering on the patient, I might have filters on facilities, providers, payees, things like that. So the goal is to be flexible in what we can do. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these next few slides. I put them here so that the content is here, but it's just going through those same elements in the actual FHIR and saying what they are. So a resource trigger for encounter, you can see that it has some FHIR path criteria, exactly what we just described, saying, hey, the previous state is not in progress, the current state is in progress. There's query criteria you can use. So that's the equivalent of using FHIR queries to define it. You say the previous state had a status of not in progress. What's interesting on the query criteria is there are these elements for requiring both and results for create or delete. One of the issues you run into when you say, what is the previous state of a resource I'm creating? It doesn't make sense. And so we have ways to say, yes, this should trigger when things are created. And then the opposite is true when you're deleting things. So you can still filter on what it was before it was deleted and then go from there. Same thing, you might represent a patient admission using an event trigger. So we have this fancy catalog of events from the standard which shall not be named called V2. And so you might say there's a V2 AO1 message, ADT AO1, if people are familiar with that. Yes, that's perfect. A lot of systems can implement that and in a very performant way because they already have a V2 implementation. So hooking into that will be simpler and kind of enable that moving forward. Same thing for the filter by. This is just expanding on what we talked through. And the shape is the same thing, just listing in the same way that we use includes and references in queries in search. All right, so now that we have a topic, we need the subscription. So again, we're linking a topic to the actual request for a client. So it needs the endpoint information. What type of channel? Is this something that's coming over a REST hook? Is this an email notification, which people laugh at, but for public health especially, email notifications are fantastic. You know, custom channels, if you're using your own infrastructure and have some internal messaging protocol, you can define all of those things. You do need to give it a URL, an address, whatever it needs for that particular channel. You also have the format information. So the MIME type, maybe you want these in JSON, maybe you're wrong and you want them in XML. We'll still let you do it. It's fine. This is a safe space. You also have the payload type, so the amount of data. And we're going to dive into that more, but it's essentially saying, do you include the whole resource, the ID, or just the notification? something happened, come check in with the server. And same thing in a different format. Again, try to make sure that everything's presented in ways that make sense. So the predefined channels, REST hook, WebSocket, email, FHIR messaging, and then you can create your own. And yes, even fax. Graham Grieve, who is not here today, unfortunately, has created a fax channel because he had a customer requirement for one. So he went and defined the fax channel so that we make sure it never fully dies. So payload types, and this is what I was talking about. We have empty, ID only, and full resource. And I like the analogy. I use the vehicles here because I think it kind of gets across the idea. I'm actually going to start at the bottom. The full resource, to me, is one of the simplest ones because you're saying, send the resources. You get a bundle with a notification, it has entries, and it has the data you're looking for. Everyone's happy, and you can go on your merry way. The problem is sometimes these things, especially if you talk about a REST hook, might be routed through another server. You might have a server that's converting your REST hook into push notifications to a mobile device. Do you really want PHI going through that? Probably not. And so then you can start stepping backwards and you can say, for instance, ID only. In this case, we're going to send you the IDs of all of those resources. You don't have to do a search. You don't have to do anything. You can just request all of these as a batched read, for instance, and say, give me all of these resources because these are all the ones that I was interested in a very nice, easy to do format, and do it in a single request. And then if even that's too much, you say, well, my IDs might have something in them that I'm not happy with. You can also do an empty payload. So essentially you just send through a notification saying something happened on a subscription and the client has to log in and figure out what happened. There's a few things to help that so that it's not just query the system and see what happens. But it's definitely going to be harder on the server, more work for the server, but a smaller payload. And so the same thing here, we can see kind of broken down when you go through the workflow. Obviously, the first step is always you get a notification because in all the cases, you're going to get a notification first. In a ping, now you're going to have to go query the server and then retrieve data. In an ID only, you're just going to retrieve those resources. And in full resources, you're done. You have everything you need. So going through this is, again, just some examples, looking at consumer use of the patient admission one. So we were defining the topic before. And now as an actual patient, I'm saying, okay, send me notifications via a REST hook, because that's going to probably be the most common for all these things. Again, that might be a server that relays it and converts it into a push notification. That's fine. We don't expect FHIR servers to implement push notifications to mobile phones internal in their certified EHR programs. So REST hook will give a lot of those types of conversions. In that case, it's going to be a patient ID filter to me because I am the patient requesting it, and do ID only because it is going through a third-party service, and I want JSON because JSON. Same thing, you could say a different view is like a medication dispense subscription. So this might be a practitioner in-house at a facility. They would use probably WebSockets instead of REST hooks because they're connecting from a web client in their facility already. It might be filtered on location. So you can say, for instance, this is the ward I'm interested in, and anytime a medication is dispensed, send me a notification, and just send me the full resource because I'm internal and on a WebSocket. So who cares? But still use FHIR JSON because why wouldn't you? See, hecklers in the front row, it's perfect. So this is just going through and filling out the same thing, looking at what those elements actually are and what their values would be in the FHIR model. So what do you get? What is a notification? We mentioned it several times by this point. Again, it's a bundle. In R4B, it's a history bundle. In R5, it's a subscription notification bundle, clearly named. The first thing it has is a subscription status, and this is the kind of meta information about what's going on. We'll dive into that, and then it'll have payload. In the case of an empty, there won't be any additional payload because all you get is your status information. In the case of ID only, you'll have the IDs in there. And in a full resource, you'll then have entries with all of the actual data. This slide is tiny little text that I don't expect you to read, but this is just showing that there is a reference implementation we keep up. It's hosted in Azure. All the code is in GitHub. There is a client-facing side, which is a React application, just the normal web React app. There is the server proxy side, which is a C# .NET 6 kind of interceptor that sits in front of a FHIR server that grabs, it only does encounter notifications, but it does that and interacts with the FHIR server behind. And there's this client host thing, and that's just an artifact of the system itself, which is to say a web UI can't receive REST hook notifications. So the client host is a thing that gets the notifications and converts them via WebSockets actually to send them into the client. So it's all on GitHub and it's all available there. If there's time, we might even run through and play with it. So there we go. There are even more links as promised. Again, there is the full walkthrough on the spec and everything else. But I think before we do questions, I will actually jump back and just quickly show what this actually looks like. And switch to dark theme because that's, I think, a little easier to see. Perfect. So this is the reference information we were talking about, and I'll show it just because it shows all the resources. It has the scenarios we use in connectathons. So patient plus a REST server, patient plus a REST endpoint, group REST, and then it has a playground where you can play with whatever you want. I'll note all the FHIR stuff is happening in the browser. So you can even test if you're working on a server that's at localhost, you can point your browser at localhost and it'll work. So it's should be pretty flexible for all those things. You can connect to R4 or R5 servers and go from there. So now that we are connected, we can go through and see. So the first thing is finding the subscriptions that the server supports. Subscription topic is just a resource. So we're just doing a search on the subscription topic resource. You can see here, we got back a search set bundle, and hopefully that's big enough. I'll make it even one bigger. And you can see this has the full response data and everything else in it. But it's just a FHIR bundle with the resource. Again, this is the clinical encounter one that we've been using, kind of the simple example because it's easy to conceptualize. So it has FHIR path criteria, query criteria, the filter bys, all of these things are here. Notification shape, etc. Selecting a patient. I don't know what patients are here, so we will just pick one at random. And we have a patient selected. So this is the part I was saying that there's a client host endpoint that's creating a publicly listening URL and forwarding those notifications to this web browser. So we can say here, we're going to create an ID only subscription. It creates that subscription and there you can see the full resource. We got a handshake message. So we can see all of that there, that it sent us a history bundle, that it had no events, but it was a handshake, and there's the subscription and the topic. And then if we start sending encounters through, it starts sending us notifications. And we can send through as many of these as we want, and it'll just keep sending them. There's a lot of things in here, and I don't want to go too deep into all of them, but we do track, like in the notifications, it tells you the event sequence, so that as a client, you can tell if there's an event that got dropped and you missed. You can say, you know, I was on event 10, now I'm on event 13. Obviously, I missed something in between. I need to go through and do recovery. We have operations that you can ask the server what were in these events I was missing, things like that, if the server wants to support those. And if not, you would just do it like you were a new client, that you do whatever queries you do. Same thing, we have a heartbeat mechanism that's defined in here. So you say I should be getting a heartbeat message at least once an hour, once a day, once a week, whatever your use case says. And that way you know that communication's actually working. And if you don't get one, then you know you can go check with the server. So there's a lot of fun things like that as we get more into it. But how am I on time?
Well, you've taken me from my main responsibility, which is keeping track of time. You still have 10 minutes before Q&A, but we can take a lot of questions if you like.
Yes, we can do that. Yeah. If we're ready for questions. If not, I can wax poetic for another 20 minutes. But
I already have a few questions here.
Oh, that's perfect.
So,
and we have some in the room as well.
Yeah, well, let's first do an online question, although I'm not sure.
You are in charge, Reed.
Is he here in the room? No, I'm coming up. I'm coming over. Yeah, please. So any guidance for server developers with regards to subscription lifecycle? So what about timeouts of subscriptions?
Yes. So
examples with REST hooks, should we auto delete ones we can't reach, or are we obligated to keep trying to reach them?
Yes, so you do have a fair bit of flexibility in that, and I don't know where it is in R4B, so I won't look it up because I think that's actually in the IG that we talk about it. In R5, everything's in the core spec, so it's very easy to find everything. In R4B, some things are in the spec because we have the new resources, and some things are in the IG. But there's a timeout that it's negotiated as part of the subscription, so you as a client can request what that timeout is. Obviously, a server can override that and whatever, modify it, send it back. When you can't reach a client, there's guidance there that you should at least mark it that it's an error, and you can delete it if you, well, you may delete it to use the proper terminology. So that's all there, and it's going to be very dependent on the use case, the channel type, everything else. If you're developing a system that's using this for business B2B notifications between, two companies that are working closely together, you might say, yeah, if I haven't received a message in an hour, that's a huge problem and I need to address it. Whereas if you're doing something for a patient, it might be a year before you're concerned about not receiving one. So there's a lot of wiggle room in there. The mechanisms are all there so that you can define those and discover those and change them. But we'll need production feedback to see if there's any more refinement needed. Yeah.
So with the payloads that were just the FHIR logical IDs instead of the fools, one, does that mean like patient P123, patient 234?
Yes.
And the intention is that once you have the FHIR logical IDs, you do read operations against the server? Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yes. And so for that, that we can say specifically, oops, mouse pad is a little finicky on exactly where it is, but not on subscription topic, but on subscription status. Here we go. So there's this notification event structure inside the subscription status, and that's where you enumerate events. And this is so that servers can also put multiple events in the same notification. If you're saying I have 10 notifications happening a second because I'm checking every time a resource is updated, you probably don't want to send actually 10 notification bundles every second. You might say I'm going to send every 2 seconds and bundle them all together. And then in that notification event, you have the event number, the timestamp, the focus, and the additional context. So in the case here, you can say, yes, the focus is encounter 1, 2, 3, 4. And the additional context was patient ABC. And if you're IDing like that, I feel sorry for you, but it gets the point across. So that'll be there for each event.
Okay, here's another question.
Yes.
I'll skip the Azure question because
there you go. It's not just the front row that can heckle.
No, yeah. There's a question here. This is maybe an interesting question around scaling.
Yes.
From the client perspective, how do you think about scaling subscriptions? One could easily imagine a scenario where you would overload a receiving system, especially with the full resource. To that end, are there any best practices or use cases where you would not recommend subscriptions?
Well, let's start with the easier part, I think, which is overloading a client. Since the subscriptions are generally client managed, if you are finding yourself overloaded, you should address that as a client. If you think a full resource payload is too big, don't request a full resource payload. That feels like the lowest hanging fruit from that one. That said, you can also start splitting things up. So there's no reason, just because you are a client, it doesn't mean everything has to flow to the same endpoint. If you're going to have 10 different subscriptions, you could have 10 different endpoints that all filter back to you eventually, but they're all going through different pipes, different processes. The second part of the question, but I should have done the harder part first, was
use cases where you,
use
cases where you would not recommend using subscriptions, or maybe you have an
Yes.
alternative.
Yeah, so the first thing is obviously REST. If you can solve your problem with REST, use REST. That is the default paradigm in FHIR, and it's there for a reason. In many, many, many use cases, you can solve your problem in REST and just use it. This is for a lot of things, especially when you're talking that REST is getting in your way. That you're saying, we were talking earlier about the polling problems. So you're saying, well, if I have to hit my server because I need to know, I need to fill a prescription. That's a good example. It's pretty important that I get that relatively quickly once I get an order, but I might be, in a small facility, something like that. I might be getting 1 or 2 a day. Okay, well, I don't need to be polling every minute to find out if there's a new prescription order. I just want the server to tell me. And so in a situation like that, it's a big benefit to use. Whereas if you're saying, well, I'm getting a prescription every 1 second anyway, well, you can poll the server. It doesn't, if there's always going to be data, it's not a very expensive thing. So it's really that. A lot of messaging-based workflows, a lot of, when you talk about things from V2, I was talking earlier with Diego about that. A lot of people have these server-driven workflows in place already. And this is kind of the bridge to gap that, to say you can start moving into FHIR, you can be using FHIR resources, you can do that. And then maybe you can adjust your workflow. I know people are very hesitant to adjust workflows. Because retraining users is nothing compared to just rewriting software. And so this is really to say that, yeah, we want to use FHIR, we want to use FHIR resources, but we have a workflow that REST doesn't fit. And that's really the goal of it. And if that's not true, don't use it.
Hi, do you know of any EHRs that use subscriptions, FHIR subscriptions, and also how much work would it be to transition from R4 to R4B or R5?
Yes, great question. So as far as production EHRs, that's been tough because it hasn't been published yet. We've been working on this since 2019, and our first opportunity to publish was when R4B was released, and FMG hasn't met since then, so we have not been able to request publication. So as soon as FMG meets again, we'll put in our publication request, which hopefully goes smoothly. And then hopefully then people will be able to start implementing it. I am aware of many EHRs who have done similar functionality, but since this wasn't published, they weren't using this. My hope is that once this is published, then everyone can add the thin veneers they need to make it compatible, because the spec has been pretty stable for over a year now. And so hopefully it will be very quick for the adoption, but that's throwing darts at the wall. So as far as moving between them, with the backport, we made everything as seamless as possible. So the subscription status and subscription topic that are in R4B are identical to the ones in R5, with the caveat of the 64-bit integer we use for the event sequencing that doesn't exist in R4B. So it's a string type in R4B, which serializes the same in JSON. So it actually works out. We put a lot of effort into making that as low a lift as possible.
Hey, can you go over the channel thing again? I
Yeah.
thought they were pre-canned channels, but you had that fax example, so I
Yes.
might have missed something.
So, and I know I have a tab for this somewhere, but I don't know where it is. So let me just find the IG. I meant to pull that up earlier. Ah, perfect. Switch to this tab. Thank you, computers. So channels, we have a whole section in the backport IG here talking about it. So what happens is and for people who aren't familiar with what, I know Brian is, but FHIR, we're trying to define the 80% stuff. We're not going to try and cover every single use case in the course spec because a lot of effort has to go into every single one of these. When we talk about REST hook, email, WebSockets, things like that, WebSocket, for instance, we had to design a whole security protocol around because the browser-based WebSocket APIs don't have security. It's just you can't use the same security you're using on a FHIR server in a WebSocket. That's just not how it was implemented. So we have this whole operation that you can use to get a token and pass through, and we made sure that you can use a single endpoint or multiple endpoints, and a lot of time and effort goes into something like that. So the channels that we predefine are ones that we say, these are gonna probably be pretty widely used. That said, we don't want to stop people from doing things in their use cases. So you can define custom channels to say, for instance, I am working in a cloud vendor and they have, Azure has Event Grid. I don't remember what the Google and AWS equivalents are, but they have an internal protocol that they use for messaging between components in their system. Okay, well, define a channel type with it. Then you can use that protocol and you can send those messages across and do it. For instance, one of the ones to make sure that the spec was working, I implemented a Zulip channel. So on the test server, the reference implementation, you can put in Zulip information and get your notifications in Zulip when a new encounter happens. So you can define a new channel type so that you can do all those fun things in a standard way that then other people could reuse. So did that answer the question, Brian? Perfect.
I have a pretty specific and then a narrower and then a more general question. So the narrow question is going back to the question from just a moment ago about like R4B, R5. If you're working on a system that is currently just using R4, can I put you in the difficult place of making a recommendation as to whether or not it is worth proceeding with some kind of subscription like logic for the time being and then porting it over to R4B later, or just waiting until R4B is released?
Well, R4B is released.
Okay.
R4B has been released. And that's why it was, that was just released. The backport IG that has all this content, that's what I have on the screen now. It's what establishes topic-based subscriptions on the subscription resource, because subscription topic and subscription status are in R4B, but the subscription resource couldn't be changed. So for instance, adding the different channel types, adding the heartbeats, the max counts, content information, timeouts, none of those exist in R4B because we couldn't modify that resource. So this is what's not published yet. It's ready to be published, I think, I hope. And so we'll hopefully have that soon. As far as what makes sense for migrating users between R4, R4B, and R5, if you have a great answer, I would love to hear it because a lot of people are interested in finding that out. I can say in the context of subscriptions, if you are adding the functionality to manage topics and manage everything else, you need these resources. We had initially done the backports just on stock R4, and we were trying to model the subscription topic, for instance, in BASIC with extensions, and it was painful. So if you're going and adding all that functionality into your server to actually do subscriptions, I think adding these resources is going to be the smaller lift. And then time frame between this and R5, again, I don't have a crystal ball on this one. So if R5 is 9 months out, maybe it makes sense to wait for R5. If R5 is 2.5 years out, probably might have been better off with R4B. So.
And then my more general question is, so I work in public health, so I'm working with a lot of stakeholders who are not necessarily, they have observed that they would like to move more quickly than they are. I'll say that. And I'm worried about creating like a server side system that is using R4B or R5, where many of our clients are like just starting to use R4. Like,
Yes.
what is the where can we go to like look at like compatibility between server and client side that are on different FHIR versions for subscriptions? Or do you have a take on, like, is there anything that we should know about that?
In subscription specifically, it's the change, like we said, was very minimal. The same subscription topic resource. The biggest difference is history bundle versus notification bundle. But even that's pretty easy to say when you're receiving one. You can just look at the two. Case in point, the proxy server that's there doing subscriptions handles both. It's one instance of one app running both, and it handles the R4 and the R5 versions. It's not too bad. If you're talking about, you know, more generally, the R4B, R5, R4, R4B, and R5 compatibility, I think that's something that we're all trying to figure out, and hopefully there will be more tooling shortly that we can all use to discern some of these things and build out systems that are more robust.
For the subscriptions, does it support compartments by any chance? Do you know, like, or is there some way to handle that?
We'll say indirectly. There's no reason why it wouldn't support a compartment. So the goal is that you can say a subscription topic covers just about anything. And so if you define your subscription to topic to say anything new in a patient compartment, as long as server implements that, that's great. We did go through a lot of effort to make sure that, I have the subscription topic open again, sure. When you build them out, oops, is this not rendering correctly? There we go. You have a lot of options for saying, you know, there's a resource trigger that you can describe, there's the event triggers, and then at the end of everything else, there's just a description. So you might not have something that's easily computable. You're going to take a hit on portability. You know, people can't just reuse that if you're just describing it in text. But especially if you're a server implementer and you say people want this topic, you can implement that topic and you don't have to worry about that computable definition. So my hope is that IGs and other communities will start building out these subscription topics, put them in the registry, and then they'll, you know, instead of having 15 different topics that you might use for a patient encounter, there'll be one. And so in something in a compartment like that, if there's a good use case, hopefully we get a topic defined and then servers can pick it up and implement it. And people then have a little more leverage to say, can you implement this widely supported topic that all your competitors are using? And then they'll say, ah, sure, we'll do that too.
My question's kind of related.
Sure.
So you had an example of subscribing to a particular patient.
Yes.
Is that a case where you would create a subscription topic and reference a patient by ID?
Yes.
And is that like is there any privacy issue with that?
So the subscription topic just says you can filter on ID. It doesn't actually have the ID in it. The resource that has the ID is the subscription resource. And since that's generally client driven, it's whoever is creating that has access to it kind of implicitly. So there shouldn't be a privacy issue. Obviously, we're not all seeing. So if there is, happily file a ticket and we will happily take a look again to see if there's more. Also with privacy, I don't know if I touched on it quite enough, but the empty payloads, that's a big nod to that, is saying you can just log in, and we do have an operation defined that you can go back and replay events. So you might say, yep, you received event 13. That doesn't tell anyone anything really. And then they have to actually go and re-authenticate with your FHIR server because they're asking for resources. And so it kind of does a nod that way to say, if you can't trust 100%, that's fine. Just send them anything. They'll come in and re-authenticate. So I know I kind of diverted there at the end. So did that cover? Hopefully a little bit. Generally speaking, if a client, I guess, let me rephrase the original one then. Generally speaking, if I'm a patient and I'm going to set up a notification, a subscription for myself, that's the only way I know my ID. And so since I have the resource of subscription, there shouldn't be any privacy issues, because if a server is broadcasting that to everyone, that's a problem. But that's no different than broadcasting my patient resource. So hopefully that's the same security context, and that should all work itself out.
I wonder if that's also the answer to a question on the channel here. If we support fax, how do we make sure the receiving client probably protects private health information?
Yes, we don't support fax. We allow you to support fax if you are really interested in it. I do not recommend fax,
Oh, no,
but
you don't?
I don't. But you know, it's as we all talk about FHIR and all of the new wonderful things we can do, it's always important to remember the long tail of implementers and the fact that, yeah, we do have to support, you know, at the end of the day, someone reading some text is going to be a notification that people can deal with. And it's the same thing we talk about with public health, like sending an email. Yeah, if you're a small county office, you can't stand up a FHIR server. That's not realistic. But you can have an email address. And so we can send you a notification to that email address that lets you take further action. And that's really the goal in this kind of core infrastructure piece, is to say, can we make sure that there's enough there that any use case can be satisfied, while we only define the use cases that we know and understand well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Is the next one, is that a break, or do we know, or do we have time for one final question, or? Yeah,
Sure.
Let's try. So this is Lee again with a couple of votes. Is this domain-specific subscription mechanism compatible with a server that would make events available on some Kafka Nets other messaging backbone? What are the benefits to managing subscriptions in FHIR instead of a more dedicated messaging infrastructure?
So yes, so Kafka, that's a message queue system, and that's the kind of thing, again, we were talking about when we talk about custom channels. That is definitely the type of thing we were thinking of too. If you have reliable message queues and things like that, those are great. And we highly encourage you to use them. We're not going to prescribe which one or how or anything like that. The benefit of managing the subscription in FHIR is that then you are opening up flexibility and interoperability. If you're saying my server internally has Kafka message queues and I can send events via that, okay, how do I register for one? How do I set that up? How do I configure it? How do I set up my endpoints, all these different things? You just have to reinvent that every time. And then you say, okay, well, instead of Kafka, we're switching to RabbitMQ. Okay, well, let's go through and re-implement all of these pieces because they're a little bit different. And so here you can say, okay, well, here we just have the multiple message channel types, and all of the external pieces are handled separately.
Do it in FHIR. Well, thank you very much, Gino, for
Thank you,
explaining topics and subscriptions. Wonderful session. Good
Thank
luck,
you.
everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.